Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Eon Podcast. We've been joined here today by Iyad El-Baghdadi. He is a writer, intellectual, human rights activist who attained international prominence during the Arab Spring. He is a stateless Palestinian refugee, but now, since his deportation from the United Arab Emirates, he is a citizen of Norway. And as I can imagine, it's quite cold up there. Iyad, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing very
Thanks
well.
for the opportunity.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for giving us the time of day. Um, you last I've heard you founded the Kawakibi Foundation, but you moved on from that, as I recall.
The Kawakib Foundation was founded in 2017, and we mostly worked most intently on it from 2020 onwards, after the events of 2019, when I was basically hunted or wanted for assassination by certain regimes. Most of last year I was not at Kawakibi, but now I'm back at Kawakibi, setting up a research center and a media engine.
Very nice, very nice. Just to clarify for the audience, you were working with different journalists, and certain regimes had problems with your work, and you ended up being a target for assassination. And this was something that was a credible piece of information that was verified by Norwegian intelligence as well, from a tip that they got from the CIA.
I don't know the details. They were never shared with me, but the CIA did share a tip with the Norwegian intelligence saying that I need to be under protection, and so I've been under protection by Norwegian authorities since 2019.
Right, and is there any particular regime that they identified, or was it a multitude of regimes?
It was the Saudi regime, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But we also know that they work closely with the United Arab Emirates and the Israelis as well.
Right, because in intelligence sharing and carrying out these kinds of international operations, they do rely on these.
Yeah, but it's also the tools that they use. So, for example, the way that they hack your phones, etc. It's Israeli software. It was operated at the time. The operator was Emirati, but of course the person who wanted this hack was Saudi.
So you've just guaranteed that I can never go to the UAE or for Umrah and Hajj anymore, right? Is that what you're telling me?
No, I think you're good. I think you're safe.
No, but I've made the Hajj just in case, so don't worry, inshallah. I think we should be able to conduct this conversation with a certain amount of openness. This happened a few months after the assassination and murder of your friend and colleague Jamal Khashoggi. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
Just as a human, how was the experience of knowing someone like Jamal Khashoggi, who had been described as somewhat pro-Saudi Arabia and a loyalist of some sorts? But when he comes out and he starts to expand his horizons with regards to democratization in the Middle East, championing human rights and free speech on a greater level, and then you see him assassinated, how does that feel as a friend and then as a colleague?
I mean, I first got to know Jamal, of course. Jamal was very famous. Khashoggi was very famous. I only knew him personally, to the point where I can say that he knows who I am and I know who he is, and we have conversations around 10 years ago. And it's funny because it happened, I was not a fan of his. And as you know, I'm coming from an Arab Spring, also a Palestinian background, where I mostly believe in democratization as an expression of popular will, rule of the people by the people. And I connect that to decolonization, ruling ourselves instead of us being ruled by others. He, as you have said, he was a loyalist to the Saudi regime, and he believed in the Saudi system. And he believed that the Saudi system has been successful in improving the lives of Saudis. So at the time, I was not very sympathetic towards him. In fact, the way that we became friends is actually pretty funny, because it started with me insulting him on Twitter. It was 2014, end of 2014. I was in a refugee camp. I had not yet received asylum in Norway. I was here in a little bit north of Oslo. It was very cold. And he actually believed in the Arab Spring. He believed in democracy and free speech and the cause of Palestine. His case that he was always making is that Saudi Arabia doesn't have anything to fear from democracy, because Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government, has been successful in improving the lives of its people. But the Egyptian and the Syrian and the Libyan they have failed. and which is why there's a that's the reason why their people wanted them gone. It was just a failure. So I kind of there was kind of an angry conversation, and this is where you see that Jamal is different, because instead of blocking me on Twitter, he followed me. He's like, you seem to have very interesting perspective and strong perspective. Let's have a conversation. And so we started talking from there. It wasn't really that friendly until 2017, when he decided to leave Saudi Arabia. He knew that he's going to be arrested. And it happened actually in September 2017 that a lot of more than 100 intellectuals and scholars and social reformers, economic reformers, and intellectuals were imprisoned in one arrest wave, and a lot of them are still in prison. So he knew that he was going to be one of them, and so he left the country before, and he chose to exile himself. We met I think once or twice. It was here in Oslo. I invited him to come and attend a human rights conference over here. And he was already thinking, because all of his life, his first identity was a journalist. Whenever people ask, what are you? He says, I'm a journalist. Even when he went to conferences, he didn't go as a keynote speaker, etc. In the case of the conference where we invited him here, he actually asked for a press pass, and he said, I'm a journalist. So he was already, even though he's in a political position at that point, because he was connected to the old regime that Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince of Saudi Arabia, has upended. He was already thinking like an activist. He was already thinking, what can we do? How can I work with these? He goes into exile, and he sees that there are large networks of Arab people such as myself who are very committed to their countries and very believe in this kind of uplifting their countries, democratizing their countries. And he's like, a lot of these young, brilliant young people are there, and I'm kind of more of a senior figure, so I can be supportive. So he was thinking a lot about disinformation. He was thinking a lot about preserving the public sphere, free speech, etc. So for sure, I remember the last time I actually interviewed him on our podcast, the Arab Tariq Manual, when he was here. And my co-writer and friend, who's currently my boss at Kawakibi, Ahmed Gatnash, he had a little recorder, and we sat down with Jamal and we were talking. He was about to leave for the airport. He's like, I have some time, so let's just sit down. And what do you know? The battery ran out in the middle of the interview, so we only caught like 1/3 of the interview. So there's a lot that was lost. It was a really interesting conversation. And I remember on the way out, Ahmed was upset because he's like, "Hey, this is such a great interview. We didn't we only got part of it." And I remember telling him, Jamal is not going anywhere. He's in exile now. He's just like us. So we're going to meet him again. There are many conversations we can have later. And it didn't really occur to me that actually that was the last time I'm going to see him. Because within a few months, I was supposed to meet him again in New York, but then it didn't work out because he actually was going to get married to, propose to his now ex-fiancée, and he couldn't make it. And his death was an extreme shock to us. I'll add just a personal note here, which is that a lot of us at that time were children of a certain generation of Arab men who, we were basically all of these, I wouldn't say young, I was in my mid-30s, but we were there basically in exile without our families, without our parents, without our fathers, while Jamal was in exile without his children, without his sons. So there was a kind of almost a father-son relationship. We saw in him kind of a father figure, and he saw in us kind of a children figure. So that's why it was particularly painful to us at a personal level, that for whatever case we couldn't protect him, but also we couldn't, unfortunately, so far we couldn't get justice for him.
I'm very sorry to hear about the loss of your friend and colleague, but I think the way this whole situation has been handled by liberal democracies Like you phrased it in one of your keynote speeches. I was listening to it earlier to prepare for the interview, and you mentioned that it is not authoritarianism or autocracy that ruins democracies, but hypocrisy. And the attitude that Western regimes showed towards the killing of Jamal Khashoggi specifically, where they prioritized oil or geostrategic significance of Saudi Arabia, and preferred to double down with the regime. And you see all the golf and the football associations and all these sports associations trying to open up the Saudi economy to more Western sort of entertainment standards or whatever. And there was really no backlash on the murder of this journalist, someone who had taken refuge in outside of Saudi Arabia, who was a critic of Saudi Arabia, and at one point a loyalist to the regime. Do you think attitudes have shifted from that, and there is an increased amount of dissatisfaction with liberal intervention? With again, you see Trump returning in the Western world.
Yeah, I mean, the question is awakening or change in attitudes among whom? Because in the end, the elites, whether we're talking about a dictatorship or a democracy, the thing about most Western democracies right now is that they are not really fully democratic. The United States, for example, has been better described as an oligarchy because you have these smaller and smaller elite groups and special interest groups that have captured politics in the country, but also have captured foreign policy in the country. And so, in a very real sense, many Americans, I mean, even with the rise of the re-election of Trump, many people, and I think I'm kind of sympathetic to that view. They say that what happened is that nobody's offering us change. Trump is radical right-wing, but he also presents himself as someone who's going to change he's going to turn the whole place upside down. On the other hand, they ran someone first it was Biden and then Kamala Harris, and the idea there was we're just going to continue as normal, and normal is good and normal works, which is kind of like slapping people in the face. Normal is not working for the majority of people. So the first part of my answer is that we have to really question how democratic a lot of these countries that purport to be democratic really are. At a popular level, for example, there is a majority, even in the United States, even among Republicans, I believe, who think that the United States should not be this supportive of Israel in its war in Gaza. I can tell you that there is a majority in Norway. Norway is one of the more pro-Palestine countries in Europe. But even in countries that you might not associate with being pro-Palestinian, such as the United Kingdom, for example, there is a majority that do not want this kind of foreign policy. So you have to ask that there is a democratic crisis in these countries. There is the fact that the popular will, the majority of people want something, and there's no way for it to happen because politicians will never actually run that. That tells you that this is also evolving into a democracy crisis. In the case of Jamal Khashoggi particularly, I think it wasn't only a matter of geopolitics and oil, etc., even though these were, of course, important considerations. The fact that we need to understand is that the United States is no longer as sensitive to the oil as before. The United States, since the Obama years, the end of the Obama years, has become a net exporter of oil. Of course, it doesn't mean that it doesn't care about what happens in the Middle East oil fields, because, of course, if there's an oil shock in any region of the world, that will cause some really, really bad fluctuations in oil everywhere in the world. So they don't want that to happen. But I think in the case of the Biden administration, the main determinant factor was Saudi's promise of normalizing with Israel. There was a kind of bargain. The idea here is, of course, for me as an Arab, I can tell you it's a very racist idea. The idea here is that normalizing with Israel, having peaceful relationship between an apartheid state and a bloodthirsty dictatorship is more important than all Arab lives. Arab dignity, Arab blood, etc. Whether it's the blood of Shireen Abu Akleh, who is Palestinian-American, killed, journalist killed by Israel in the occupied territories, or whether it is Jamal Khashoggi. Again, was a resident of the United States, and he worked at the Washington Post, or whether it is the children of Gaza. It doesn't matter. Like a calculation has been made that for whoever is running foreign policy in the United States, having good relationship with normalizing relationship with Israel, accepting Israel as you can see what Israel is right now, is more important to them than any human rights concerns. That's absolutely not a priority. They can say it's a priority, but it has never been a priority.
Yeah, this brings me very nicely to this concern that we see that Western commentators have been discussing the issue that we now see unfolding in Syria as a matter of geostrategy or geopolitics, as a regime change or not regime change, Israel's greater plans in the region, as opposed to the individual human experiences of the Syrian native people. And we saw recently, for example, on a huge interview with Jeffrey Sachs and Tucker Carlson, they're talking about Syria and the regime change or the revolution, whatever you want to call it. It's completely from a bird's eye perspective. It's completely dehumanizing in that it's just another move by the CIA or by the deep state or by Israel in the region. How do you see this sort of media characterization in the matter when it comes to Syria? You're pretty popular in the Twitter sphere. How do you deal with this kind of dehumanization, like you mentioned with the Arab blood and dignity?
So I would say that there was kind of the Arab Spring did not lead to successful political transitions yet. I still think sometimes people ask me, has the Arab Spring succeeded? I'll say it's too early to tell because this is an intergenerational transition. But there was a jump in awareness. And I think part of this, I'm not talking about on behalf of others, but I'm talking about on behalf of myself, like how my awareness has shifted. Part of that is understanding that we have to center ourselves, because if you don't center yourselves, nobody will center you. These people who, whether it's Jeffrey Sachs or whether it's Tucker Carlson or someone else, they're always going to be speaking to their own audiences, who are the majority of whom are not actually among us. They're not Arabs, they're not Muslims, they're not natives of the region, they're not from the Middle East. They're coming with their own perspective, and they're centering their own perspective. They're not centering us. So in a certain way, like several years ago, I realized and decided that I should not be reacting to what they're saying. I should be driving my own narrative, my own story, even explaining to people where the world is, and from our position, and producing knowledge from our position, rather than responding to someone who doesn't even see you. Like you said, itself is dehumanizing. But ultimately, it's really because they can't see agency coming from the natives of the region. They really think that the only possible actors are Western actors or Western aligned actors, or the enemies of Western actors or Western aligned actors. So they don't really see the human being at the popular, at the native, grassroots popular level. Between 2013, the Syrian Uprising started in 2011. It started initially as a largely non-violent protest movement. In fact, the first protest in Syria did not call for the downfall of the regime. So, the big slogan that was chanted across the region, 20 out of 22 Arab countries had some kind of protest. And the most popular chant was, I'll say it in Arabic and then I translate it, Al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, which means the people demand the downfall of the regime. In Syria, they did not actually initially say, we want the downfall of the regime. They said, we want the reform of the regime, Islah al-nizam. So initially, they didn't even ask for Assad to be gone. They initially asked for Assad to, use this moment, this historical moment, to implement some kind of reform agenda, maybe, review the constitution, maybe even live up to the constitution. The problem in a lot of Arab countries and dictatorship generally is not that the constitution is bad, is that it's never implemented. Really, it's whatever the people in power want. So as you know, eventually Assad refused to go, and he decided for his own strategic reasons that he can win a civil war, but he cannot win a protest movement, but he can win a civil war. And that's eventually what happened. He had a civil war, and the gates of hell opened, and Syria became a Disneyland for every jihadist and proxy group. From ISIS to Al-Qaeda to Kurdish separatists to Shia militias from aligned with Iran or organized by Iran, etc. Eventually, he thought he won, and for a while he thought he won. But the thing is, his win was never sustainable because he relied upon very strong adversaries. So around 2013, between 2013 and 2016, is when we had very dramatic events in the Syrian civil war. Because around 2013 is when I would say it had stopped being primarily a protest movement and it became primarily a war. So this is when a lot of these people, Western commentators, between 2011 and 2013, either they didn't even pay attention to Syria at all. Keep in mind, other things, very important things were happening in the Arab region, including the Egyptian uprising, the Bahraini uprising, the Libyan uprising, etc. Tunisia as well, Yemen, etc. So there was a lot in the news, but for Syrians in particular, they didn't really pay a lot of attention until it became a war. Again, this tells you a little bit about they only pay attention when there's like a geopolitical armed conflict, but when it's like the person on the street who's chanting for their rights, whether it's 10 people or 100,000 people, they don't really pay that much attention. Many of them actually were supportive of the Syrian uprising until that point. The moment it became a war, that's where everyone kind of changed. And I think around the same time also there was a series of events that there was the chemical weapons massacres by Assad in I believe it was August of 2013. After that, there was like the Russian intervention. There was also the rise of ISIS. So it was kind of a confusing area. But by 2016, Assad had succeeded in occupying Aleppo, which is Syria's second largest city. It's up in the north. In many ways, it's kind of Syria's second capital. It's an economic system. It's an economic powerhouse as well, close to Turkey. Many people at the time thought, okay, this means he has won. And in fact, it seemed that he had won. It was around that time that, in this period of time where I'm Palestinian myself. I don't have direct links to Syria, even though my mother was born in Syria. She's Palestinian, but born in Syria. We had this instinctive support of a people who are demanding freedom and dignity. And we knew just how brutal and bloodthirsty and treasonous the Assad regime is. And so at some point, there was a lot of debates with these like mostly white, Western liberal faces. And I think by 2016, I had been blocked by all of them, and I blocked all of them, and I didn't pay attention to much what was happening since then, even though that ecosystem continued to grow. I would tell you that a lot of this ecosystem was supported or at least enabled by Russia for its own, geopolitical reasons. Even though I don't want to make it seem like all of these figures are either Russia supported or proxies of, they're not. A lot of these people actually genuinely believe they have a certain worldview. I would say it's also that, there's also this current of anti-imperialist, like leftist anti-imperialists who are statists. But what I mean by statists is that they look at the map and they see states. They don't see citizens, right? They're blind to the real struggle of liberation. For them, it's a geopolitical map. It's a geopolitical struggle rather than a struggle for liberation by a people. And a lot of them are from the West, and they come with a certain privilege of the West, even a Western supremacism, even in opposition of the West. So, for example, they would be like you said in your question, they would be more interested about what Western countries want out of this region. This is a CIA plot. This is a Mossad plot. This is a Turkish plot, an Iranian plot, etc. In a sense, many of them are actually anti-Western when it comes to foreign policy. Like they don't like the current Western elites. It's not that they think that the West should be equal with the rest of the world. Some of these people still believe that the West is supreme and better and should be better. It's just that they have a dispute with the elites, with the ruling elites right now, because the ruling elites is not them. And so you can see that there, sometimes you see that they make it seem like whoever is fighting the West is a good guy. And I think we know from our own history that this is not always true.
Right. So you mentioned a lot of different streams, and within the ecosystem that was anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian, or however would you like to describe it. And this ecosystem was developed in and around the conflict in Syria. The left tends to see, at least the online left tends to see the world in a statist sort of perspective, and I think that's a very appropriate characterization of them, where they don't see the individual human struggles of the Syrian people or the Palestinian people. You're a Palestinian. How do you, or just Palestinians around you, reconcile with the Syrian revolution? You said there was an initial amount of support and sympathy for people wanting dignity and a certain amount of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you that Syrians and Palestinians actually go. There's a bit of historical context, I think, which your audience might appreciate, especially if they have some kind of familiarity. They've met Syrians, they've met Palestinians, maybe they've visited the region generally. But until the Nakba, until 1948, when Israel, was founded. Long before the rise of the current nation states in the region, our ancestors who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they had their own political projects, their own political visions, etc. Of course, much of the region was occupied by the Ottoman Empire at the time, and the Ottoman Empire was already in its collapsing years, and it was kind of, the writing was on the wall. Even the late Ottoman Empire had already adopted nationalism and already stopped using kind of a pan-Islamic kind of narrative. So you did have certain figures in the Arab region who thought that we want to be decolonized. We don't want to be under the boot of any Western nation, but also we want to be independent. And they had a kind of movement where they wanted an Arab state. They conceived of the state as a constitutional monarchy / democracy, basically kind of like the British system, for example, where you have a monarch, but the monarch is not really part of politics, but you also have an elected parliament. In fact, our organization, Kawakibi Foundation, is named after one of those intellectuals, the Syrian intellectuals called Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, who was part of like this wider movement. At that time, even though there was a Palestinian identity and a Syrian identity and a Lebanese identity, in other words, these regions have their own identities, such as, like, I would say in Pakistan, for example, a Punjabi has their own identity. Someone from up north will have their own identity. Someone from Karachi will have their own identity. It doesn't mean that there are nationalisms. It's not a nationalism. Doesn't mean that we want our own country. It just means basically that we have our local identity. So Palestinians and Syrians and others in the Levant had their own identity, but they did not develop their own nationalism. Their nationalism was an Arab nationalism. They wanted this region to unite, and the Palestinians considered themselves part of a larger state, part of a larger organization.
Of Al-Sham, perhaps.
Sorry?
Of the Sham region, perhaps.
Yeah, so the idea really, because there were negotiations after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the idea was that the Hashemites basically are a family from Hijaz, who, of course, claim, and maybe in a substantiated way, descend from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And there was kind of negotiations that the British, the Arab armies, basically, there was an Arab revolutionary army that fought against the Ottomans for Arab independence, and the idea was that the British is going to support the creation of an Arab state under a Hashemite king who would be a constitutional monarch, and that it will encompass all of the Levant plus Iraq. So this will be a very big state. What we know is that, of course, the British and the French, even though they made these promises to the Arabs, at the same time, the British promised Palestine to the Zionist movement, the Balfour Declaration, and also had a secret agreement with the French that they're actually going to divide the region among themselves. So in 1920, there was a constitutional convention in Damascus, where a lot of Arab intellectuals came together and they said, we have to create our political project. they created committees, and they had like delegates from all across the region, including from Palestine, who said basically that we believe this is our political project. It was basically about creating a new constitutional order. This, of course, was interrupted by French colonialism, and this new state was never happened because the French invaded at that time and stopped it from happening. But what's interesting here is that the Palestinians who signed the signed their as delegates to this constitutional convention, they referred to Palestine as southern Syria. They, because for them it's they use the word Palestine, and they consider themselves Palestinian, but they consider them to be part of a bigger region. So the roots of solidarity, you can say, between Palestinians and Syrians, I think solidarity is not an accurate word. You have solidarity with someone who's an other. This is more than solidarity because we see ourselves as the same people.
Right. This is just a joint cause.
Exactly. So it's really later after the rise of Israel, etc., that Palestinians adopted Palestinian nationalism to say that Palestine should be its own state, separate from other regions, etc. Again, this does not doesn't mean that
it doesn't undercut.
Identity didn't exist.
It doesn't undercut Palestinian identity, but the distinction between identity.
There's a book by I think it was Rashid Khalid who wrote a book about a Palestinian identity, and he traced the rise of Palestinian identity to I can't remember, either the late 18th century or the early 19th century.
Right. And like you said, that there's no distinction between the Palestinian cause or the Syrian cause. But you saw a lot of allies, whether they be in the intellectual sphere or the political military sense, Hezbollah, Shia militias from Iraq, the Irani IRGC forces. While on the one hand, you would see them as allies for the quote-unquote Palestinian national cause, on the other hand, you see them in Syria and the role that they played, perpetrating massacres, facilitating a very despotic regime, having Russia come in and drop anti-imperialist bombs, which I don't know if they kill less or more babies. I don't know what the ruling is on anti-imperialist aerial bombardment. But how did you or the Palestinian diaspora reconcile that double or dual role that Hezbollah was playing, or Iraqi militias were playing, or Iran was playing in the region?
I mean, I'd refer to Hamas itself, actually, as an example. The thing about Palestinians is that Palestinians first of all, Palestinians are very diverse. We were diverse even before the Nakba, before 1948. But because Palestinians have been forced to live in very different conditions, like if you live in Gaza, you have a very different life than if you live in the West Bank, or whether you live as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, or whether you live as a refugee or in a diaspora, etc. So different lived experiences eventually mean that you develop different political consciousness. Again, because Palestinians are still united by this kind of common trauma and their love for their land and for their love of each other, really. But I mean, growing up Palestinian, I can tell you that we always knew that we were the weaker side. And we always were looking for any kind of solidarity. We know eventually that if we stand alone, and we have always stood alone, unfortunately, but we know that if we stand alone, then the most we can do is resist. And resistance is a reaction. Someone is attacking and you resist. So resistance itself is not proactive; it's a reaction. We knew also that. The Arab people mostly, actually largely are with us in their hearts, with us in their emotions, with us in their feelings. In fact, we know that our adversaries, the Israelis, when they talk about us, they don't say Palestinians. Actually, they deny the existence of Palestinians. They say Arabs. And we know that there's 500 million Arabs, nearly 500 million Arabs surrounding 7 million Jews in Israel. So we know for us that unity is our salvation. We need those Arabs around us to awaken and to have control over their own destiny. And we know that is what would change the balance of power, and that's what would get Israel to change its behavior and get the world also to change its behavior. I kind of compare this to a certain degree to Kashmir, where you see Kashmiris, for example, over the years have adopted a more Islamic, pan-Islamic kind of worldview, because again, they know that if they're alone, they're very small. But if this is them, if this is Muslims, then they're actually not that strong. They're actually strong. So like this kind of identity formation here, or this identity, this belief in this identity, also has very strategic, very important. I'm not saying that it's cynical. It's actually very, very heartfelt and really, really deep. But I'm saying that it also means something in the strategic realm as well. I don't know. I sometimes I have a tendency to talk too much.
No, it's perfectly fine. I agree with you. It's not cynical. It's a completely organic process by which the Kashmiris or the Palestinian develop or appeal to a larger Arab or Muslim identity, because it's completely within the realm of reasonability that it can both be a heartfelt, sincere sentiment and also be politically expedient. Like you mentioned, the Palestinian identity was more of a cultural one, and then for it to be transformed into a political or nationalist sort of identity, it was forced by the existence of the entity that is Israel. This is completely acceptable. But speaking about the greater Arab identity, George Galloway, a champion of the Arab people, has said that he is now abandoning the Arab cause and he thinks it's a lost cause. Like, how do you see these kinds of quote-unquote allies for the larger Muslim world or for the Arab people when they come around because you don't match their geopolitics or whatever? What's the kind of response that you would have as an Arab, as a Palestinian, as a Muslim? You identified, by the way, earlier that you don't like responding, but that's not my point here.
I would say that it's a good thing for us if Galloway leaves us alone. It's a good thing if he's kind of. I was seeing reports earlier about how Israel has recalled this ambassador from Ireland, and there was an Irish activist or figure who was like being interviewed, and he said, we wanted them. He was asked to comment, and he's like, we wanted them to. We were asking for the expulsion of the ambassador. The ambassador kind of self-expelled, so it's like it's fine. Again, if we have been asking Galloway to leave us alone for a while, and he didn't, and now he's now that one of his favorite dictators is kicked out of power, he will leave us alone. The thing is. And this is what frustrates me as a Palestinian, because a lot of these people are like, the Palestinian cause is now a lost cause because of geopolitics or something. The thing is, we have there's been war on Palestine for over 100 years. And, Rashid Khalid wrote this book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, where it's actually a very accessible book. And I hope more of your readers, more of your viewers can read it. We have been crushed, we have been betrayed, we have brutalized, and we never gave up. They could break our backs, but they could never break our spirit. And this has frustrated the Israelis for a very long time, because three generations have come and gone, 4 generations have come and gone in the Middle East. Compare the Middle East in 1948 to the Middle East now. Everything has changed. Regimes have changed. The world has changed. One thing has been a constant. The Palestinians were resisting. We never won, but we never gave up. And this has become part of our DNA. Resistance is part of our DNA. Dignity is part of our DNA. And we for us, it's really a belief in historical truths. You can't fight history. You can't roll back the world to the past. You can't change human nature. When people are subjugated, they will resist. Regardless how much violence you unleash on them, people will resist. So the thing is, for Galloway and others to kind of say that, hey, Palestinians have now lost, this just tells you what kind of allies they are. It tells you that when things don't go their way, they're willing to walk away. As a Palestinian, I don't have the luxury to walk away. We're kind of, our resistance has never been conditional upon how geopolitics goes. We're always going to be resisting. And in the end, we are, as Palestinians, we're a living testament not only against Galloway and people like him who walk in and out of causes whenever it's convenient. Our very existence invalidates the world order, because the world order will tell you that this is a world order of international law and justice and equality, and it's liberal. But our existence itself tells you that this is all a sham. To people like him, even though I noted that we should not always base our conversations upon responding to others who do not see us as human beings. But I'd say, it's a welcome development if Galloway leaves us alone.
You think it's beneficial that people move from the geostrategic importance of combating Greater Israel or Western imperialism and towards a more human-based appreciation of the struggle, where we try to appreciate the Palestinian cause without, any geostrategic implications? That's what you're saying.
No, geopolitical implications are very important. I'm not saying they're not important, but I'm saying that they're not the only thing that's important. We need a balanced view. A balanced view means, like, even I'm really impressed, for example, with, as subhanAllah, as you grow up and you read you read the Quran all the time from the time you're a kid, and as you grow up, you start to get new insights. And I'm really, we studied dualism, for example, in university, about like this dualistic idea, like the Greek philosophy about mind and matter, subjective and objective, etc. And when you go to the Quran, you don't see this, and you see that in the Quran, rationality is actually both emotion and logic. It's not separated as two separate things. And so I feel like, from our point of view as Muslims, we kind of accept that things have to be in balance. And if things are out of balance, then there's something wrong. I'm not saying that we should only look at the human perspective without geopolitics. I'm saying that we need to broaden our view, and the world is actually more complicated than just looking at it from only one point of view or one lens. When it comes to the struggle against Israel, I think we need a new models of understanding Israel. I think one of the, I think it was the guy who wrote The Art of War, Sun Tzu. Very famous book about war, etc. And I think one of his most famous statements, he says, I don't remember the exact quote, but maybe we can find it. But it's something about how, if you want to win, you have to understand yourself and your enemy. You can't understand yourself and not understand your enemy, and you cannot understand your enemy and not understand yourself. In the case of our struggle with Israel, and also, by the way, the Israeli struggles with us, they don't know us, and in many ways we don't know them. I think people a lot of the time, they resist for their own reasons. They know their own history, their own narrative. And from that point of view, they're like, this is how we want to solve this problem. It's also useful to look at the other side and see, how do they see their struggle? How do they see their position? What's going on in their society? What are the trends, positive or negative, in their society? And based upon that, you create a strategy. The strategy of resistance, which has been applied in Palestine, Israel, by Palestinians against Israel since the 1960s. The 1960s was a time, 1950s and 60s, really after the Second World War, was the time of decolonization of the world. And one of the biggest stories of decolonization, now we don't really hear about it much, but it was huge at the time, was Algeria. Because Algeria was the first part of the Arab world that was occupied. It was, I think, in the 1820s. And it was under occupation by France for 132 years, enormous amount of time. And to the French, it was not considered a colony. It was considered part of France. So Algeria was not a colony of France. It was France. And of course, as years went by, of course, Algeria had a big, it was an important refuge for Jews. A lot of Jewish people lived in Algerian Jews, basically after the fall of Andalus in Spain. And Andalusia had, like Muslim Spain, basically had a big Jewish population. After the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of them were expelled, basically, and a lot of them ended up living in the Maghreb region, in the Arabic region. And so eventually the French would give, first of all, the French, because this is France, the French French settlers started coming from France and settling in Algeria. But also there was another factor which I think many people miss, which is that eventually the French authorities gave citizenship only to Jewish and Christian Algerians. So if you're a Muslim, you're a stateless person, or you don't have French citizenship, even though you live on your own land. But if you're Jewish or if you're Christian, then you can become French. There's an important book written by, the book is called The Colonizer and the Colonized. It's written by a Tunisian Jewish intellectual. His name is Albert Memmi. Very, very fascinating book. Not a very big book. He was Tunisian himself, but Tunisia was also under French occupation, the same kind of regime as Algeria. And he was talking about how he was Jewish himself, and he was anti-colonial. And he was talking about how this kind of living where you're aware that you're not good enough to be French, you're not like 100% French, but also there's a system of privileges that tells you that because you're not Muslim, because you're not, you're not native in that case, you can become French. There's this very complicated system where they're telling you that you're better than the natives, but you're not good enough to be like 100% French. Anyway, long introduction, but to tell you that such a regime of immense brutality, the French colonial regime, very racist regime also, because keep in mind that France at the time, a lot of these years was a democracy. So this is the inherent hypocrisy here, because they were saying that we're a democracy, while they're really essentially they had an apartheid regime in French Algeria, where if you are a certain kind of person, then you're French, and if you're not, then you don't have the equal rights. This is what the definition of apartheid is. You have a permanent population living in the same country. Some of them have full rights, some of them don't have rights permanently. So the fall of French colonialism in Algeria was a huge event. Again, 132 years ended with Algerian nationalists taking up arms, basically waging war against France and French colonists. And eventually the way that it ended is that the colony was no longer sustainable. It was too expensive to maintain. And they went home. They went to France. So the Palestinians at the time, this happened in 1962. And the occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza happened in 1967, 5 years later. So you can imagine that when when Israel occupied the rest of historical Palestine, what was the model that was in the mind of Palestinians at the time? It was the successful end of the of French colonialism in Algeria. So they adopted the same mentality, and because Israel, when it was still founded, was actually a European. It was a settler colony by European Jewish people. The majority of them basically was Europeans. Of course, this has changed over the years because a lot of Arab Jews, like the Jews that I mentioned who lived in Algeria, ended up moving to Israel under a lot of different circumstances. Some of them didn't really want to.
Dubious at best.
Sorry?
Dubious circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, some of them there was some, for example, in Iraq there was actual persecution.
Yeah.
In other cases, it appeared that Israel actually created some problems with the local population to get.
There was foul play,
so it's not the same across, right? So from that point, Palestinians were trying to fight Israel as if it's Algerian nationalists fighting French colonialism. The model that we adopted is we need to make sure that the settler colony is unlivable, unsustainable, so they will all leave. My argument for many years right now is that this is the wrong way to understand Israel, and it's not the most effective way to fight Israel. I wouldn't say that there are different models of decolonization. I spoke about it on my Twitter. I mentioned the South African model, for example, even though I think in Palestine it's not either or. We have to kind of create our own model. But I would just summarize it this way. Israel is more like an iceberg, both in the fact that it's really big, but it also has like a very deep network of support under it. You don't punch an iceberg, you melt an iceberg. And so we need to understand really what makes Israel strong. And from there, we can devise the right strategy of liberation. Because I can tell you, Israel is not sustainable. This is not sustainable. I don't think Israel will exist. I think the 2030s really might be the last decade for Israel. I don't think it will live long enough to see its 100th year. I think a lot of us living here today will see the day of Palestinian liberation. Our kids definitely will see that day. But the way that we approach this fight, it's a very winnable fight, is what I'm saying. But we need to change the models that we're using to approach this fight.
Right. And And when considering, like you mentioned earlier, this kind of conflict, you look at both the geostrategic implications of the greater region, of the wider region, as well as the human cost. So why don't we look at both of these things? The Arab monarchies were normalizing Assad. They had accepted the fact that any sort of export of international jihad, it had failed in Iraq, maybe it had failed in Syria. The regime change experimentation that the Saudis and the Emiratis had been involved with, it didn't work out, it seems. They're normalizing Assad, and then all of a sudden they end up with what we have right now in Syria. How do you think the Arab regimes are going to respond to this now?
It's a good question. Also, I'll add to what your introduction is that initially after 2011, because the big a lot of these Arab regimes, especially the Gulf regimes, the main thing that was worrying them is Iran. The Iranian regime, Iran is a big country, 82 million people, big economy, sanctioned a lot and everything, but also has a very strong army and a native military industry. And historically, it has exported its revolution. It's a threat to them, and it's obvious that it was their main foreign policy anxiety was the Iranian regime. Knowing that Assad is an ally of the Arab regime, initially they thought they supported his removal. But at the same time, they were ambivalent, because at the same time they were afraid, and this is if you go back to statements in 2011 and 2012, they would say that we're afraid that the same thing will happen in Syria as happened in Egypt, which is you have kind of a democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood aligned government. Keep in mind, when Arab dictators and also Zionists use the word Muslim Brotherhood, they mean any Muslim who believes that Islam should or can inspire us in the political realm. Any Muslim who believes that Muslims deserve democracy, or any Muslim who talks about politics, really, with a sense of native agency, they call a Muslim Brotherhood, whether or not even it's someone who's against the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization.
And now, by the way, if any Muslim is involved in political violence, they're a Takfiri Wahhabi.
Exactly.
Regardless
what happens.
There's two types. You can be a Takfiri Wahhabi, or you can be an Ikhwani.
Exactly. And the thing is here is that I remember in Egypt there were Christians who were arrested, and they said they're Muslim Brotherhood. Even in they're Coptic Christians, but because they believe in the uprising, they believe in democracy, etc., they said, you guys are Ikhwanis as well. So they said the same initially, is Syria will become kind of we can't risk that. So they wanted to weaken Assad, but they were ambivalent about Assad actually falling and being replaced by a stable and strong and democratic Syria, because of course they don't want a democracy anywhere. This is something which is, like I said, drives the geopolitical strategy of Israel. Israel is very aware that it's a very small country. It's a narrow country, 7 million Jews, who are not even a majority within the confines of historical Palestine, because 7 million Jews, 7 million Palestinians. And they're very aware that they're surrounded by 500 million, 500 million Arabs, who themselves are surrounded by another 1 billion Muslims. So they know that if this region unites, they know that this is going to be very, very, very bad for them, regardless of ideology, etc. If you are that player, let's say you're playing a computer game, like a puzzle game or a geopolitical game, Risk, etc. If you are that player, you will not want all of these to unite against you. You would not want that. So Israel has always seen democratization for Arabs as a lethal threat to its superiority. And also Arab regimes, especially if you talk about the United Arab Emirates, for example, yes, the United Arab Emirates is a country of 10 million people, but only 1 million are citizens. It's a very small country when, in the grand scheme of things. And it started wars with very big, I don't want to say, it's at some point, of course, it was in a proxy war against Iran, which is 82 million people. It also had a lot of, back and forth with Turkey, which is, again, 80 million people. And it got really deeply involved in Egyptian politics, which is 100 million people. So, of course, again, a small country that knows that if this whole region if this region of giants, if the giants stand up, then, suddenly you're very, very small. And so it's better if the giants are on the ground. so this drives their their strategy here. So initially, they thought, we want to bloody Assad's nose, but we were really not really that keen about him leaving. By the way, Israel, there was a tweet that went viral from a 2013 a statement by the head of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Army, where he actually said, black and white, we don't want Assad to go. We prefer if Assad, stays. Even we don't want Syria to be stable. We don't want Syria to be, it's better if he's weakened, but we don't want him to go. After he won, however, this is really interesting because they actually liked the fact. They respected him for it. It's like, we tried to throw everything at this guy, but he actually won. In a way, they respected that because they were very afraid of the Gaddafi example, of the dictator who ends up being lynched by his own people, because the Gaddafi model is different from the Saddam model. Saddam model, you can say this was a foreign invasion and Saddam ended up looking like a hero, In the Gaddafi example, even though NATO was involved, etc., but there was no foreign army on the ground. It was all, Libyans. So that was a dangerous thing for them. So, like, if all of these millions around us actually start to get a taste for, lynching their own dictators, then we're in trouble. They felt that Assad did them a favor because Assad made a new statement in town. He's like, if you try to rebel against me, I'm going to wipe you, and I will win. And that actually was something useful to them. This is why Assad's family eventually started living in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. In fact, when we didn't know in the initial hours after the fall of Assad, we didn't know who he was. The Syrians themselves, they said that only two countries will take him, either Russia or the United Arab Emirates. So they were not really, they didn't want Syria to be democratic and prosperous, but they also didn't want, they didn't want Assad to win, at least initially. So yeah, they kind of normalized him in the end, especially after the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman really rose after 2014, and this was after Assad had won, and so he wasn't part of the policy making before that point. But yeah,
Yeah.
forgive me for my.
No, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good summation of what the Assad regime was to the Arab, monarchies in the surrounding region. And now, do you think that they see a potential threat for democratization or the completion of a potential Arab Spring project in Syria? Do they see that?
I think they do. Yeah.
Do you think they see that?
I think they do. They do see a threat, but at the same time, so if we look at the examples, one of the advantages of having a very regional team such as ours in Kawakibi, we have, for example, I have a Sudanese colleague, Khalid Al-Bey. I have an Egyptian colleague, Rami Assam. I have a Syrian colleague, Razan Safour. So we're kind of learning, and also, of course, Ahmed and Nadine, who are from Libya. So we have multiple models of what happened and how foreign countries tried to derail a democratic transition. So we had the Sudan model, where you had like both the Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE kind of really intervening, trying their best basically and they eventually managed to turn the democratic transition into a civil war, which we see right now in Sudan. We see Libya, where again, like the Khalifa Haftar, for example, who is the de facto ruler of Eastern Libya, had a very strong relationship with Tel Aviv, with the Israelis as well. So you see that they will be trying to derail this transition. They will be trying their best to do whatever they can to make sure that either they can capture this state or derail this transition in a direction which is good for them. There are causes for optimism, however. The first is that a lot of the world actually wants Syria to stabilize because of the refugee question. You can see, for example, right after Assad fell, you see so many videos and pictures of cars jamming streets, everyone going back home. And, this kind of breaks the mind of so many right-wing populists in Europe who are always, they based a lot of their politics on saying that we're against refugees. we can't have these refugees forever, etc. And they're like, okay, refugees are going home now because Assad is gone. And so there is a demand, at least in Europe and Western countries, I think I would also imagine in Turkey as well, that we want Syria to be stable because that's the best thing for us politically, internal domestic politics, because that will ease the flow of refugees. The second cause for optimism really is that Syrians are tired of war. Syrians don't want to, like, they just emerged out of a 13-year civil war in which everybody has tragedies, everybody is traumatized, and I don't think they have an appetite to a renewed war, to a fresh war. So I think it's I'm not saying it's unlikely that there will be armed clashes somewhere or like some kind of violence. I think actually it's likely, but I don't think we're gonna. I don't think the likelihood of having like an all-out civil war again, I think, is pretty low. The third cause for optimism really is that this was Syrians liberating themselves. The fact that it was the natives themselves who did this, everybody abandoned Syria. Turkey is the only one who basically kind of played some kind of facilitating role in the current fall of Assad. But again, like the HTS are not really Turkish proxies, and they're not. In many cases, they are very, very Syrian. And this kind of tells you, like, when you leave things to their own people, to the people of the house themselves, they will figure out what's good for them. I'm not saying that like we're safe. Of course, we're not safe. I think there are reasons for optimism, but also reasons for caution. And we know that they're going to try their best to make sure that this is not a successful model for the democratization, liberation, etc. for a country. The first Arab dictator to comment on the events and tie them back to his own country was Sisi of Egypt. He actually gave a speech, I think 3 days ago. Very weird, very kind of weird speech, because it was not an interview, just speaking to the camera. And what's really strange is that he did not congratulate the Syrian people. He did not, he just said, this happened. And then he said something about how, don't worry. He's talking to his own people. He's like, don't worry, we're okay. So he's already telegraphing his anxiety that, maybe the people here are going to see what happened there. So yeah, I'm sure that they're not very happy about this.
So this is your skepticism as far as infighting, the potential for infighting is concerned, the potential for Middle Eastern intervention or Western intervention or Israeli intervention is concerned, because they wouldn't want an example like this to exist, where you have a people, native people figuring out their own country and their own affairs. Are you skeptical about the way it happened? In as much as Turkey's involvement, foreign militiamen being there, we had Uzbeks, Tajiks, Uyghurs, Pakistanis fighting in different factions. And like you mentioned earlier in the interview, how Syria became a Disneyland at one point for international jihadism. Does the way it unfolded, post the Astana agreement via Idlib, with Turkish-backed support, you had Ibrahim Qalin show up in Damascus and sort of do this show of power. How do you see that with regards to what is going to come in the future? And how do you see Erdogan's role?
I think a lot of books, a lot of PhDs are going to be written about this, about the evolution really of these 13 years, especially if you're a student or a scholar of Islamist movements. It's interesting that even what happened with the Taliban, for example, was seen as a motivation, as a positive model for a lot of people in Islamist movement, because they said, okay, the Taliban, so long you keep fighting and you don't dissolve, the foreigner is going to leave eventually, and when the foreigner leaves, the country is yours. And so I do remember that after 2021, after the fall of the U.S.-supported Afghan state, there were also lots of conversations in Syria about this. The one thing maybe that would help this conversation is understanding the evolution of Islamist thought between the beginning, 2011. Of course, 2011 was the death of the assassination of bin Laden, which came in the middle of the Arab Spring. So keep in mind that bin Laden and Salafi jihadis, for a very long time, they adopted this kind of worldview or this kind of strategy of saying, we need to fight the entire world. We are looking for global jihad. And they kind of adopted, and I think a lot of people believed, and maybe even some of us believed, even Western people believed, that only violence can remove these regimes. And so of course, they eventually found that, what kind of violence is it? Because in the end, you're going to be fighting the soldier of the soldier of the soldier of the king. It's not, you're not going to be face to face with the king, right? So it felt at the time of bin Laden's death that there was a battle of narratives because I remember I was part of the movement, and many people was like, wait, non-violence worked. Look what happened in Egypt. Look what happened in Tunisia, etc. Then others were saying, but wait, look at Syria. Maybe violence is still needed, right? But the model for Salafi jihad, for Islamist revolutionaries at the time, was the caliphate model, which is why they had Al-Qaeda, which is basically, again, doing war everywhere, and also ISIS, which, again, wanted to create a global caliphate, which would grow and grow and grow. The fall of ISIS after 2016, the defeat of ISIS, which I believed was pretty much, inevitable. You can't go to war with the entire world and then expect to win. There was an evolution of thought among the Islamists who were in the Syrian theater, and they started to look at the Taliban, the emirate model, instead of the caliphate model. So they said, instead of us thinking we need to conquer the entire world, let's just think about having an emirate, a statelet, where we can implement our own model. And this model is going to be very successful, it's going to be very brilliant, etc. And then people across the world, the Muslim world, are going to see that this is a positive model, and then that's how we can win, because everyone's going to want to adopt our model. Joulani himself, the head of HTS, seems to have gone through this kind of transition. You can see, for example, that HTS in 2016, 2017, I don't remember when it was formed, but early on when it was formed, they were not raising the Syrian flag, the national flag. They did not believe in nationalism. So they were raising their own flag, which was basically, the kalma, etc. It's only later now that they're actually adopting. So you can see that there's kind of an ideological evolution there, where they're actually adopting, they're believing in the nation state. Maybe they're still not nationalists. To be more specifically about your question about Turkish involvement, there's a well-known, there's been enough reports that came out that actually say that Turkey was quite involved in the fall of Assad. Not in the sense that it was not Turkish fighters, they're not even Turkish proxies, but Turkey allowed it to go ahead. They allowed it to go ahead, they shared intelligence. At some point, we all knew that Turkey is the long-term winner in the region, because Iran is seen as a foreigner, but Turkey is not seen as a foreigner, maybe for religious reasons, etc. Sunni, Shia, etc., but also historical ties, because the region was under the Ottomans for a very long time, and there are social bonds and historical bonds between the countries. That said, HTS is not really a Turkish proxy. They have a working relationship with Turkey, but they are not really controlled by Turkey, is what the way to say it. And it seems that the main gripe, the main point of contention between them is, do you want a centralized state or a decentralized state? I get the impression that Joulani and the HTS, and also a lot of Syrians, they want a decentralized state. Decentralized state will present a problem for Turkey, because it means self-rule for the Kurdish areas, which I don't think Turkey would be very happy about. But that is the correct solution for Syria. Like, if you want Syria to be stable, you need to give ethnic minorities, etc., especially that Kurds are they cover an important area in Syria. That's the right solution for Syria, but it's not the right solution for Turkey. So far, things seem to be working, because when we saw the agreement, there was an agreement that was published between HTS and SDF. SDF are basically Kurdish, led forces in northern Syria. When we saw the agreement by which the SDF agreed to raise the revolution flag and join the Syrian National Project, we saw that there are certain, demands from each party to each party. The SDF asked no ethnic cleansing of Kurds, for example. The SNA, for example, certain Syrian National Army, which is actually a Turkish proxy, and has engaged in Kurdish in attacks on Kurds, that they will be curbed. Meanwhile, the HTS side asked of the SDF that we don't want any PKK PKK are terrorists. Basically, they would dispute the fact that they're terrorists. Maybe I should not call them terrorists because I don't want to adopt this war on terror kind of rhetoric. But the PKK are basically a separatist group who mainly fight the Turkish state. And they have a complicated relationship with Kurdish people. Kurdish people themselves also are very diverse. I mean, we might think that all Kurds basically are kind of like supportive of the PKK, or all Kurds are basically, it's not true at all. Kurds are also very diverse. And Kurds are part of the region. They're not exactly foreigners. They are from the soil of the region. And so it remains to be seen how things are going to work out. I think things seem to be working out so far, but this would be one of the biggest things I would worry about. Will Turkey allow Syrians to select the right political organization which is right for them and for their own country and for their own ethnic makeup? Or will it try to intervene to make sure that the Kurdish region does not pose a threat to them in the future?
That, I think, pretty much is a good analysis of the situation with Turkey with regards to Syria and how this plays out. It remains to be seen. It seems that the settlement is stable right now, that they don't want to rock the boat too much. But how do you see the relationship with Israel? It's already occupying the Golan Heights. It's done all these strategic airstrikes against significant military and government infrastructure. And they seem to be wanting to create an increased buffer zone between the new state of Syria and that would allow them to take up more territory within the Syria. Will the new Syria accept that, do you think?
So I've seen commentary. So Julani himself was asked about Israel, and he indicated that Syrians are not ready for another war. And it's true, because they don't have a modern army. They don't have the capacity, the military capacity to enter a war with Israel at this point. This said, I was writing something about this yesterday. I might end up posting it as well. But essentially, out of all territory that Israel occupied in 1967, in 1967, Israel ended up occupying the Golan Heights from Syria. It ended up occupying eastern Jerusalem and the West Bank. It ended up occupying the Gaza Strip, and it ended up occupying the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Eventually, it left the Sinai Peninsula. Eventually, it left the Gaza Strip, or at least it blockaded the Gaza Strip. It maintained the occupation, instead of being inside the Gaza Strip, became like on the fringes of the Gaza Strip. The whole thing about the West Bank, of course, it's taking the West Bank piece by piece. It's annexing it de facto, but it has not really announced that it has annexed it, because the two-state solution is supposed to be conditioned upon Palestinian state somewhere in the West Bank, or initially all of the West Bank. The only area that it has not returned, and it has annexed many years ago, is the Golan Heights. So out of every area in the Arab region that Israel has occupied after 1967, the only regions that it has already said, I will never return it, it's mine, is the Golan Heights. And this is for, geopolitical reasons, because the Golan Heights is heights, they're high. Meanwhile, most of Israel is the northern part of Israel is not as high. So basically they're overlooking a very important part of the Israeli state, but also because the majority, actually virtually all of the water supply of Israel comes from that area, comes from the Sea of Galilee. There have been some commentators, Syrian commentators, who are kind of saying that the new Syrian, whoever leads Syria should continue the kind of quiet with Israel. And each of these people has their own, understanding. I think many of them are thinking, we need to rebuild the country before we enter any kind of, we need to become strong before we enter a fight. And some of them, my critique to a lot of them is that they're still thinking of Israel of the 1970s. This is a different Israel. today's Israel is a different Israel. It's an Israel which is high on its own power. It's an Israel that doesn't believe in coexistence or diplomacy. It only believes in bombing people. It's an Israel which is led by religious extremists. In fact, Netanyahu has already said that he wants to boost settlement activity in the Golan Heights and in the buffer zone. I don't think they're ever going to leave the buffer zone. I think they're going to start settling it. At the same time, even Smotrich, who's the, I think, Minister of Finance in Israel, who's again a religious Zionist, he was interviewed in a documentary several months ago, and he said that the state of Israel should expand into Jordan and Damascus. So they're already saying that actually we want this and we're going to keep it. This Israeli actor is no longer a rational actor. This is an actor who only believes in hard power, only believes in bullying. I think that whoever runs New Syria is going to have a problem for two reasons. The first is that this Israel does not want to stop bombing everything in your country. In fact, it wants to establish a doctrine that we can bomb anything, anywhere, anytime we want. And you cannot do anything. You can't stop us. This is the new doctrine of Israel. This is how they believe security happens. Security happens only if you become allied with us, such as Egypt or Jordan or the Gulf states, or if we can bomb you whenever the heck we want. It's not something that New Syria is going to have to live with, because again, the point I mentioned earlier about how the Golan is the only part that Israel did not return, annexed, basically said this is mine. This precludes any kind of peace with Syria. There's nothing like the whole idea of peace was based upon land for peace. We took your land, and we will give back the land, and in return for giving back the land, you will give us peace. This was the whole point of the peace with Egypt, for example, that pull out of the Sinai Peninsula, which you occupied, and in return for returning our land, we will give you peace. This was not the case. This cannot happen in Syria. In other words, there's no political or diplomatic formula for New Syria to normalize with Israel, because Israel is never going to leave the Golan, and New Syria is never, it's not possible for it to say, yeah, okay, you can keep the Golan and just leave us alone. Again, they're not going to leave them alone. The second reason is that the Golan is actually, and the buffer zone is actually very geopolitically important. It's high lands, it's very close to Damascus. In other words, Damascus is not safe so long Israel has the Golan Heights and the areas that it just occupied. It gives Israel basically too much of a geopolitical advantage. At the same time, we know that the Syrian army has been destroyed. The Syrian army really, this is the thing with the armies. I mean, we were joking a lot about this in the previous years since the Arab Spring started, how Arab militias are actually pretty strong, but Arab armies are actually pretty weak. Like you can see Hamas, for example, and Hezbollah, and even like the militia, even like at some level, even like the Iraqi resistance to the United States, for example, when Arabs form a militia, they can actually form a really, really strong fighting force. But for some reason, Arab armies, it's a national army, they fold very quickly. They don't really fight wars very well. But also in the case of Assad, he changed his army. The army was no longer built in order to go to war against another army. It was built to go to war against his own people, and it became a militia, basically. So yes, he had fighter jets, he had a navy, but what was the navy or the fighters just going to do? The jets basically were being used to just bomb residential neighborhoods. So in a sense, it's a huge dilemma, and it's a big question mark. I think that those Syrians who think that Israel is going to leave you alone, if you leave it alone, are going to be mistaken.
Right. You think there's a lot of wishful thinking on the part of the new Syrian management if they think they can normalize with Israel, because Israel
maybe
is not
maybe they're just not sharing the real.
Right.
Maybe they're just being careful. Maybe they're just being careful. But I would just say that if you think that this is the same Israel of the 1970s and 80s, which was, aggressive but rational, this is not the same Israel anymore.
Right. How do you see the role of the axis of resistance after the fall of Assad? Because Syria was a sort of a resupplying refueling deeper for them when it concerns with the Lebanon. How do you see Hezbollah taking this? Their leadership has primarily been decapitated. They've lost a lot of fighting forces in the fight against Israel. Hamas was very dependent on this resupply route as well. How do you see the conflict with Israel continuing for these militia groups?
The new leader or de facto leader of Hezbollah, I don't know if he's been appointed or there's still a process. He has already acknowledged that the supply routes have been cut. I think Hezbollah basically, maybe if Nasrallah was still alive, he would be thinking that I should have escalated faster, because Hezbollah was following this strategy from the start of slowed escalation, where you can't. Makes it very difficult for you to know when is the point where I can say, hey, this is the point, this is a red line. So you draw a red line and they just move up a little bit above the red line, and then you have to redraw the red line and so on. So they were escalating and escalating, and there was always this question: is like, when are they going to go out to like full scale, or what would look? It was already like full scale, but what would look like or be perceived by everyone as this is a different phase. And they never did. They just wanted to, like, there was some kind of constraint, or restraint at least. And I think this was really in line with Iranian strategy, which is to be patient and to go, to avoid open confrontation and to prefer attrition, like long-term attrition. In the case of, which is why, I mean, a lot of these militias were not made for open confrontations or for a short-term war. They were made and fitted for a long-term war of attrition. And because of that, Israel won this round. For war of attrition to be successful, you need to continue. It has to be long-term. So there's question marks and really like things to study about the strategy, the Iranian strategy and the Hezbollah strategy. Like, was this the right, or is this the right strategy against Israel, given how different Israel is after October 7th? The other side of this is that, I mean, there are calls among hardliners in Iran asking the government of Iran to reopen channels and to try to strike a deal with the new Syrian authorities. Even though Assad was their ally, they're saying that there are geopolitical reasons why they might want to deal with us still. I don't know like how receptive the new administration in Syria will be. But I would just mention that for a certain number of years in the 80s, it made some kind of geopolitical sense for the Syrian regime, whoever runs it, like whoever is the player over there. It made sense to support Hezbollah to attack Israel, because in a way it's like exacting a price for Israel for occupying some Syrian territory without going to war openly with Syria. So I don't think we're going to see this. I highly doubt we're going to see it. But if we see some kind of continued relationship between New Syria and the Iran axis, it would be kind of a card to say to Israel, we can make your life, we can actually continue supplying Hezbollah if you don't back off. Like we can play our own game as well. So maybe back off so that we don't have to do this. That said, I wouldn't. It's a difficult position that a lot of these militias find themselves in. It's also a difficult position that New Syria finds itself in. And many Palestinians and pro-Palestinians, of course, asking legitimate questions about this strategy of resistance and what does it mean for this current war, etc. I mean, like I said earlier in the interview, Palestinians have always been resisting, regardless what the geopolitical, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's whether we think that we can win or not. We've always been resisting. We've never actually laid down we've never laid down arms, and we've never accepted to become subjugated. So for us as Palestinians, we're always going to be resisting. The question is, how? What's the strategy?
What's the scene going to look like with the new Trump administration? It's coming in on January. Israel, do you think, will be emboldened by the administration and the situation in Syria, or do you think that there'll be a check on them?
It's very highly unlikely that Trump is going to check Israel in any way. But in any case, I mean, Biden didn't check them either. I mean, we have to ask the questions like, what can Trump do that Biden hasn't done? Or what will Trump allow that Biden has not enabled already? However, we know what Trump wants. We know the plan. We really know the plan right from the start, right after the elections, that the Israeli plan is to annex the West Bank, either the entirety of the West Bank or the majority of the West Bank, and to announce basically that the two-state solution is dead. Palestinian statehood is dead. Khalas, this is all now Israel now. And then find a solution, try to find some kind of solution for solution here being basically, I'm just being kind of ironic here, some kind of way to deal with the 7 million Palestinians who are still living between the river and the sea, whether it's continued ethnic cleansing or whether it's continued genocide, such as in Gaza, or basically like expel them, etc. But this is we know that this is the plan. I will just say this. I mean, because we're coming to. I mean, this interview is still in December, and the inauguration is going to be like later in January. So soon enough, we might know what's going to actually happen. But I'll just say this: in many cases, the problem for Israel is when it gets what it wants. Because Israel right now, this Israel, like I said, is different. It's a different kind of Israel. It is not thinking strategically or long term. It's captured by Netanyahu and his people who are, number one, fanatical. When I say fanatical, I mean they're not logical. Some of these people literally think that Israel can get into as much trouble as it wants, and God is going to save it. Some of these people literally think that the third temple is going to descend from the sky into Jerusalem, and that's going to be like the Jewish Messiah is going to arise. I'm not saying that this is a mainstream or majority opinion in Israel, but some of these are his allies. Some of them actually hold these thoughts. The second is that they're not he's motivated by political survival. A lot of what he does is really for political consumption inside Israel. So in many cases, when you allow Israel to do whatever it wants, it ends up doing things which are very self-destructive for it on the long term. It would be a long conversation for me to explain exactly where Israel's vulnerability is, but I'll just stop here.
You asked the question that what is it the Trump administration can do which the Biden administration hasn't already done? But we saw the Abraham Accords and the shifting of the capital to Jerusalem by the Trump administration, and in a sense, you could say that that was the root cause of what eventually ended up being the 7th of October, the normalization of the Israeli state amongst the Arab regimes, as well as the shifting of the capital to Jerusalem. Do you think that there will be a new normal, or will there be a return to a pre-7th October Abraham Accords in full swing? Recognizing the capital of Jerusalem. We see in the UAE, they have priority counters for Israeli citizens and, all of this ridiculousness. Do you see that?
I did notice that there are people who ask me the same question. They said, on the one hand, you can say that Israel has gotten itself into some trouble or into a lot of trouble, given its conduct so far. On the other hand, maybe Trump is going to come and there's going to be just another Abrahamic Accords and Saudi Arabia is going to normalize, etc. And my response to them is really that Trump is a deal maker. And a deal normally means that I give you something, you give me something. And it feels like there's no deals left to be made, because it seems that Israel simply wants everything. Like there's nothing that wants to offer. It's also that I mean, I know that we mentioned Saudi Arabia a lot. Saudi Arabia, or at least Mohammed bin Salman himself, has been allied with Israel, but not at the state. Not at the state level. Like Saudi Arabia as a state has not had official diplomatic relations with Israel. But even I think not very long back, Mohammed bin Salman had an interview where he said Israel is not an enemy. And he said, actually, Iran is the enemy, right? Even people like Mohammed bin Salman, who are dictators, cannot ignore overriding popular will. And the fact is that the anger and the hatred of Israeli actions is seething in the Arab region, especially among Arabs who are closer, who have interacted a lot with Palestinians, and also those who are countries like Saudi Arabia have some of the highest social media penetration. So it's not like people there don't know what's happening. I think it's highly unlikely after what happened after the genocide that any Arab regime is going to be able to normalize relations with Israel, regardless the cost. I mean, regardless what is being offered, because what's being told right now. Keep in mind that even before October 7th, so before the carnage, before the genocide, Biden entered the White House saying, "I want to build on the Abrahamic Accords." And his whole push was that, MBS is amenable to this, and I'm gonna he fist bumped MBS, and he's like, we're going back to being friends, and he didn't accomplish it, even before October 7th. So I don't know what's going to happen after October 7th. After I don't know what kind of a deal can be made, because what's being said is that, you see, keep in mind that the deal making that happened between 2016, when Trump's first term, was at the time that MBS is trying to secure his rule. He needed an ally. He needed the deal. He needed to make sure that he is supreme and he is unchallenged in Saudi Arabia, and he's completely accepted by the entire world as the ruler of Saudi Arabia, because it was kind of touch and go at the time, especially after the Khashoggi murder, which we talked about. This is different. This is a different Saudi Arabia. MBS has already won. He's already secure in his base in Saudi Arabia. He doesn't need it to be shaky. He doesn't need to give people more reasons to challenge him inside Saudi Arabia. So the deals that were made then, I don't think they're going to be able to be made now. Keep in mind that one more point to add is that after October 7th, we have seen, MBS has been saying for a very long time that Israel is not the enemy, but Iran is the enemy. So what happened right after October 7th? You saw the first diplomatic visit. I'm not sure whether it is the Saudi foreign minister who visited Iran or the reverse, but it was the first contact in a very long time.
It was the Saudi one that visited.
It was the Saudi who went to Iran. And basically, what is the message? The message is like, keep us out of this. We're not part of this. Because the Iranian formula was, if I am threatened, I'm going to attack the oil fields. If I cannot export oil, nobody can export oil. So his whole narrative was, because the whole motivation was, I want to ally with Israel so that I can militarily deter Iran. But now we see that even with this, he can't actually militarily, like when push comes to shove, he's going to basically say, hey, listen, keep me out of this. I don't want to. I want to build my own NEOM country, my own SimCities project here. And I'm not gonna I don't want to be part of any big geopolitical fights. And I think that's going to continue. I would just add that MBS is really good at dragging people. He's really good at promising and then not delivering. He's really good at letting you think that he's just about to sign. You just have to give him a little bit more, and then he actually has no intention of signing.
Right, that's a unique trait that I didn't know about him. I thought he was primarily a Sims player. There's that one interview, I think on CBS, where they ask him, what do you do in your free time? And he says, I love video games. We're never going to make Umrah al-Hajj now, are we? Anyways, it's a very complex situation that I think that needs a lot of unpacking. I think the narrative online has been very simplified. You've given a lot of time to this on our platform. It's been very pleasurable speaking with you. Again, like we said, we're in December. Who knows what happens when the Trump administration comes in? In closing, I would just like to ask you, as somebody who was on the forefront of the Arab Spring, and that sort of formed your personality in terms of the work that you do. What about the human cost of the Arab Spring? That's something that gets ignored a lot, and we see it in Syria right now. I mean, Libya we've all forgotten about, Egypt we've all forgotten about, but now the wound has been reopened in Syria. You described it as an intergenerational process. There's been a lot of awareness, and a new normal has been created. Do you think the cost in terms of the human life that was lost or the tragedies that were created, do you think the cost that we paid was worth it?
The first thing I would say is that when revolutions happen, is more like an earthquake. It's not. It's not exactly a lot of the time. It's not a choice. Something snaps and something becomes much bigger. So even the people who took to the streets in the beginning of the Arab Spring did not know that this was going to happen. They did not even they did not appreciate the enormity of what was about to happen. So saying it's worth it or not worth it makes it appear as if we had a choice of either doing this or not, while actually it is the fragility of these regimes and this corruption of these regimes that made them snap. The second really is that you might have mentioned that I've written a book about the Middle East called The Middle East Crisis Factory, and I think there was an analogy that I used towards the end of the book where I speak about a friend who I knew back in the UAE who she was in an abusive household. She was married. It was in a very abusive relationship, and she would be. I mean, at the time I ran an animation workshop. I was we had a training workshop teaching people how to make their own animations and cartoons, and she was very talented, but she was also always scared. And sometimes I would almost want to ask her, what's going on. And it took her a while before she confided that, there's fights and there's violence and, abuse and stuff like that. After the Arab Spring, she said that she got a divorce. And I asked her, what happened since you were living, you were tolerating this situation. She said the Arab Spring inspired me. She actually said, when I saw people take to the streets and demand their rights, I thought, why can't I do the same? As it happened, he actually kidnapped the daughter and he ran to another country. And she had to go through hell. She's trying to at least, I don't know what happened in the story for many years now because I've been in exile for almost more than 10 years. But she went through hell after that. It wasn't easy. The question becomes, if you know someone who's abused and living in a very abusive relationship and they stand up for their rights, or something snaps in them and they say, no, you can't do this anymore. And then as a result, the abusive figure, instead of him respecting this, becomes even more violent. What are we going to say to the abused? Are we going to ask, is it worth it? We're never going to say that because it's very dehumanizing. You're kind of saying that you should accept to live in an abusive situation because it's better than being beaten. It just doesn't understand human motivations, because in the end, it's really about self-respect. When people respect themselves, people feel their own dignity. We've seen this actually with many uprisings, but I would also only mention the Sudanese uprising recently that removed Omar Bashir in 2019. It started with bread lines. It was people lining up to buy bread, and escalated from there. Some people think it's about bread. It's not about bread. It's about bread for the first 5 minutes. After that, it became, why do I have to suffer like this? It becomes about dignity very quickly. And I think from all literature and all human experience, we know that people will do anything for their dignity. Where this will end up is in God's hands. In Arabic, we say the word dawla, which means state, comes from a root which means to circulate. So, for example, exchanging currency is called mudawala because it changes hands. So the word dawla in Arabic, state itself, is named like that because we acknowledge in the Arabic language that it doesn't last. It will be replaced. Every state in the world has been replaced or has replaced a state that came before it. So we know that it's not forever. All of that said, it doesn't mean that we should be blind to the human cost. I mean, my family was part of the human cost as well. I lost my father earlier this year, and my father he he lost his mind after the arrest, after my arrest in the United Arab Emirates. It was never the same. My family had to move several times. They became refugees again and again. I have had to live under protection for a very long time, separated from my family for a very long time. But all of that is nothing compared to others who lost their lives, are in prison for a long time. A lot of people have spent, like in Egypt, for example, have spent the majority of the last 10 years in prison. When this happens, you don't blame the abused victim who stood up for their rights. You blame the tyrannical abuser who, instead of respecting people's rights, decided that I want to destroy their lives rather than let them live free. So if we want to speak about the human cost, we have to look squarely at those who have committed these violations, which are the dictators.
Wow, those are powerful words and something to think about for everyone who was on the peripheries of the Arab Spring as third-party observers. But when you speak with people who were actively involved and suffered the consequences, and we hope and pray that your father is in a better place and has better company than what we can provide, and that I hope your family finds some solace in being part of this greater movement. And the human story of a woman deciding to divorce it's not nothing. It's not nothing. I think it's a very good illustrative example of how people get hope from these kinds of mass movements. Iyad, you've been very patient. We'll let you rant and rave about everything. It's very fun speaking with you. We hope we can see you soon again, inshallah. And I hope that the audience will leave more questions in the comments and that you can try to engage with them whenever next you have time, inshallah. Thank you, Iyad. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.